Amen. Okay, so we have someone special with us today, coming, well, Trinidad born, coming all the way from the United States. And I would like to introduce him. He would be our presenter today. But before he start, well, before I introduce him, I just feel like, we should just say a short prayer because this topic is maybe kind of sensitive. So let's close our eyes, please. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, you know our mission this afternoon, oh Lord, is to help those who are hurting, help those who are going through so many stuff and they don't know which way to turn, they don't know what to do, oh Lord. And so, Father, we thank you for sending your servant, Dr. Jacob, oh Lord, Father, and I ask that your Holy Spirit will condescend upon him, Lord, and that whatsoever he speaks, Lord, would be coming straight from you, oh Lord, and that when we leave here, Lord, it wouldn't be that this was a great program, Lord, but somebody would be touched, somebody would be helped, somebody would be blessed. So we thank you again for this opportunity. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So Dr. John Jacob, he is the president of ConneXions, a company with a mission to train relationship and life coaches. He holds a PhD in psychology and is the host of Road to Romance, a talk show program at 3ABN. The company's research has led the development of ConneXions tests that can predict problems in a personal or professional relationship before they occur. Dr. Jacob teaches courses in counseling and marriage and family therapy at the Loma Linda University. So at this time, we would like to welcome Dr. John Jacob to the forefront.
Thank you, Sister Abigail. I'd like to thank you and Sister Athleen for the invitation. Yes, I have not been to your wonderful church, but I still do feel at home. Longdenville, as you know, is, well, I think you know, but I don't think everyone here knows. I actually was born and raised for the first few years of my life right there in Longdenville, in a nice little house right off the main road. I actually I attended Longdenville RC school for a little bit, and then also attended Shogunas RC school, and then passed, to go to Presentation College Shogunas. From Presentation College Shogunas, I went to what was then CUC, Caribbean Union College. I think you call it now USC. So yes, I have roots in not just Trinidad, but Longdenville, and all of my mom's family are from there. So yeah, I do feel at home, and I'm hoping that one day when this pandemic is over, I can pay you guys a real visit. So let's get started. Let's get right into it. I tend to talk a little fast, but since I'm among Trinis, I'm not really worried about that. I think we're used to fast talking. But at the end, please feel free to save your questions if you have any questions. If I said something too fast or you need some clarification, just feel free to put it in the chat. And I think Sister Abigail and Sister Athleen are going to be monitoring that so that we can make sure that none of your questions are missed. Okay, so jumping right in. Yeah, can you see the screen? Oh wait, did you guys did you allow me
you are co-host. You're
okay. Yeah, so are you seeing the screen then?
No. Just a second.
Okay, you should be seeing it now then?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Um, okay, let's get right into it. So I would like to begin by not necessarily reading a few verses, but just to discuss a few verses from one of my favorite Bible characters. As you can tell, is Job, and I'd like to thank Micaiah for that reading at the very
Micaiah.
beginning. What is it, Micaiah?
Micaiah.
Micaiah, thank you. I'd like to thank Micaiah for that that reading. That was well done. Thank you, sir. I can see that you have a future in broadcasts and presentations. That's very good. All right, let me find this quickly. Yeah, so I'll just summarize it. So as you know, Job is referenced very often by anyone looking for solace in suffering. And the interesting thing is that it really starts off with, have you considered Job? He's a perfect man, a man that eschews evil. And to have God describe someone as blameless, I think is quite an honor, because sometimes we think that we're blameless, but for God to say, yes, you are, I find no fault in you, that is a high honor. And so the scriptures that refer to Job and describe his suffering, I thought it was very interesting that Job was able to withstand everything that was thrown at him by the devil, including, of course, having his own wife suggest to him that he should curse God and die, because she, I suppose, couldn't even bear the suffering that he was going through. Apparently, it was affecting her more than it was affecting him. But the important thing is that keep in mind that Job did nothing wrong, and yet was suffering all of these life-threatening trauma. So what comes to your mind when you think about Job? Because this is what comes to my mind. Number one, good people in horrible life circumstances can have thoughts of dying. Job did get to the point when he said, I wish that the day that I was born was cursed. I wish that my mother had never actually brought me to term and had never given birth to me. And so as good as he was and as connected as he was to God, he actually got to the point where the pain was so unbearable that even Job said, I wish I was never born. I wish if I could be dead, that would be preferable. So yes, good people can have life circumstances that can bring them to that point. The second thing I thought about when I read these passages is that godly people can wish for death. I think there's a notion out there by some people that, if brother so-and-so was more connected to God, he wouldn't have thought about suicide. If sister so-and-so had a better relationship with God, she wouldn't have wished herself dead. But we see here right away in this passage with Job that this is absolutely incorrect. You can be very much connected to God and also at the same time experiencing such pain and such anguish that you could wish that you were not alive. Number three, I noticed how the relationship with God can create a coping mechanism. The fact that his wife could say to him, curse God and die, kind of tells us that she recognized that the only thing keeping him from going over the edge is that relationship with God, the only thing, which is why she had to say, why don't you give up? And the way to give up is to actually give up on God. So our relationships that we have nurtured with God, they are a buffer in a time of trial and suffering and crisis. So yes, his wife did ask him to curse God and die, and we know that he wouldn't. So I don't think any one of us have come close to experiencing what he experienced. 7 children taken in one day, camels, cattle. I mean, in those days, their net worth was with those, livestock and things that they had. For us, it might be someone coming and telling us our house just burned down and our car was stolen, and every stock that we had in the stock market has just been reduced to zero, and we broke and we have nothing. So all of that came to Job back to back, one after the other, because Satan was timing how he brought each of these tragedies, trying to break him. And at the end of everything, including losing his children, Job said, you know what, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked will I return to the earth. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In spite of everything, I will continue to maintain my hold upon God. But then, as you keep reading, chapter 2, chapter 3, notice when the dam broke for Job. It literally broke only when his 3 unsupportive friends showed up and refused to say anything positive, refused to say anything supportive. Imagine your wife told you to curse God and die, you wouldn't. Your children are gone, your property gone, everything gone, and you were able to maintain until your friends show up. So I want to ask you, who are your friends? Who are your friends? Because your friends, as you could see here, they can make you or break you. Sometimes, the Bible says there's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. Again, highlighting the fact that friends are paramount in terms of how you would be able to cope with some of the situations that will come in your life. So, sometimes I think we need to reevaluate who our friends are. We have this phrase that we use, fair weather friends. We need to make sure that we don't have those type of friends. We need to have friends who will be with us in thick and thin, and preferably friends who are also connected to God, so they wouldn't say something like Job's wife. So I have a question for you, and feel free to put it in the chat. The question is, could Job be described as suicidal by today's standards? So you haven't, I understand that I think last week or the week before, you had another speaker that spoke about suicide prevention. So you have a good idea. I think you have a good idea of what you look for when someone is suicidal. So knowing the story of Job and what we've shared so far, would you say that Job is suicidal? If you want to put that in the chat, feel free to do so, because at the end, I want to compare what you think now and what you think when we get to the end. But yeah, would you say that Job by today's standards, not any other, but just today's standards, would you say that he was suicidal? And you can put that in the chat and then we revisit that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. I just want to go into a few facts about suicide, just a bit. There seems to be a little bit of a difference between Eastern nations, especially Pacific Rim countries, Japan, China, and Western nations, the United States, Canada, Europe, the UK. There seems to be a bit of a difference in terms of the driving force behind what we call suicide ideation or suicidal thoughts. And in the East, dishonor and shame can drive someone to that point quite a bit. The whole dishonor thing is really, really, really big in the East, and you want to make sure that you don't bring shame to yourself or shame to your family. And so the suicide rate over there is pretty high, but usually it is because someone felt that they had let their family down. On our side of the Pacific, we tend to see people driven to that point because of excessive pain, whether it's emotional or physical pain, and also hopelessness. So if you look at the little equation I have here, ideas and thoughts about dying often become suicidal attempts when the pain increases exponentially and your ability to cope with it or your hopefulness that it might end decreases. So when those things go, the pain goes up, the hope goes down, that is the point at which people tend to break and start thinking about, well, should I just find a way to bring this to an end? Now, it's good to know the warning signs, of course, of what to look out for. That's the way that we would help our family and friends if they got to this point. But I think it's better to know the risk factors that might suggest that something like this could actually happen. So let's take a little look at some of those. We start with some statistics. Many teenagers still believe that suicide is reversible. I know that when I first did the research and I stumbled on this, I know it was kind of hard to accept, because you're thinking, well, surely if you're thinking about ending your life, you must know that ending your life means ending your life, right? But surprisingly, when they're interviewed, teenagers, very often they think that this is not a cessation of life, but an end to the pain. And they're not always clear that this is it. You are not coming back from this. So this is something that we need to know, because there's a lot of unrealism that is out there with regard to how teenagers, and of course the younger, the more likely that this is so. But 50% of the time, for another statistics, 50% of the time, over 50%, alcohol or drugs are a factor. So there's an author by the name of Michael Gladwell, who wrote a book called The Tipping Point. A very good book, bestseller. And what they found is that when you introduce alcohol and drugs into the mix, you're already depressed, you're already feeling hopeless, and then you decide to address it by using alcohol or drugs, that usually is a tipping point. Also more often attempted by females. So suicide is more often attempted by females. This is almost an international fact, but it's more successfully completed by males. So it seems that when men decide to take their lives, they usually try to find more lethal means. So it's less common that a man will use pills, for instance. You'd probably find like a gun or try to hang himself or something. So it's more lethal when men attempt it. Now, there are 130 suicides completed in the United States each day. Interestingly, 70% of them are by white males. Here in Trinidad, the statistic says that suicide occurs every 4 days, one suicide every 4 days, and the majority of them are by males of Indian descent. Now, these are statistics, but I want to throw out a caveat as I say this. It is not helpful to focus either in the United States on white males or in Trinidad on males of Indian descent, because what that will do is it'll create a sort of a blind spot that prevents you from seeing someone who doesn't fit that demographic, who might actually be in crisis. So, statistics are good to know, but they're not good to focus on. I saw this phrase, I don't really like it, but I put it up as it is, the suicide capital of the world. So there is one country in the world where they have the most suicides per capita, meaning when you take into consideration the population. So I have a map here and it's kind of obvious, I think I'm making it too obvious, but I wanted you to guess, which country do you think it is? Obviously, it's one of those countries. You could see Trinidad and Tobago, so it could be Venezuela, it could be Suriname, it could be Guyana, it could be Curacao. Which country do you think has the highest? Since you're not able to answer, to say it back to me, I'm just going to tell you, it is Guyana. Guyana actually has the highest number of suicides per capita in the entire world. Okay. So there are some parents, and I've spoken to some parents who have come to see me because their child, their teenager was suicidal and they wanted me to intervene. And it's not uncommon for a parent to say, I think he's just going through a phase. This is absolutely the wrong way to think about this. This should not be thought of as a phase. A teenager who actually experiences suicidal ideas or thoughts to the point where they literally are considering taking their lives, and I mean in a serious way, where they have means, they have a plan, they know exactly what they're going to do. If you ask them if there's anything you could do to talk them out of it, they usually would say no, there's nothing. So that kind of that teenager that fits in that category, this is not a phase. This is a predictive sort of experience, predicting bigger problems down the road. So what the research is showing is that it's predictive of those problems, and those problems become evident by age 30. Also, the teenager who is experiencing that, you should make an assumption that there is some pathology. Pathology simply means there is some kind of a mental health problem that is now on the rise. There are quite a few disorders that only show up in late teens and early adulthood. So you should assume that this child, if this is somebody that you know, this person is on their way, and they're going to be 15 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts by the time they're 30. So parents, don't ignore this. If your child is going through this phase, do not call it a phase. It's not a phase. Even if it appears to go away, you shouldn't assume that it's gone away for good and there's nothing else to think about. This is not like catching the common cold, or getting some kind of illness and then you take some medication and it's gone. This is psychological, it's mental, it's physiological, and you should assume that this person would need to be monitored for a very long time. Suicide can be attempted even by teens wanting to live. I think it is natural for us to think that anyone who becomes suicidal automatically wants to die. And that is absolutely not so. Very often those teens want to live, but they don't see how they could continue to live with the pain, the level of pain that they've been enduring. So the wish to die, by the way, has no age restrictions, none whatsoever. We're talking mostly about teens right now, but adults, the elderly, and by the way, suicidal attempts, it's very high among the elderly because that's when people have quite a bit of depression and they've lost hope. Their children are not doing for them the way they expected, and financial problems are more critical at that time. So it could happen at any age, but it is often balanced by a wish to live, unless an imbalance occurs. So let's see what that looks like. So let's look at this scale, right? It's, again, risk factors, and we're putting them in a balance. On the left side is wishing to die, and on the right side is wishing to live. But notice that the right side, wishing to live, is being tipped down. And the point that I'm trying to make here is, at any given moment, someone can have some situational things going on that cause them to, like, I wish I was gone. I wish I wasn't here. I wish I could die. But that's not necessarily the same thing as I wish I could take my life. Wishing to die becomes, I wish I can do it myself. I wish I can end my life. It goes from one to the other when you tip the scale with any of these risk factors. So let's go through them, because these are the things that you need to look out for. If you have a friend, if you have a parent, if you have someone in the church, anyone that you care about, if you see any of these risk factors, then you should draw closer to them and try to see what you can do to help. There's no point in waiting until the risk factor becomes an attempt to then try to intervene, right? So the first one is a serious loss or a trauma. So anyone with a history of childhood trauma, then you're at high risk. It could be anything. It could be abuse. It could be neglect. And then the serious loss. Very often people who have lost, I know a few people who have lost parents at as early as age 7, and it really impacts them in a negative way. So struggles with sexual orientation. I know in the church, this is pretty serious in the church, because then concepts of morality come in. But I need to let you know that how you handle your child, if your child is struggling with sexual orientation, makes all the difference in the world, because suicide attempts among children who are having the struggle, it's very, very high. That number is very high, where children push the child and say, no, this is not happening in my house. You're going to be straight. You are not going to tell me that you this or that. Again, this pushes the child to a feeling of hopelessness because even the parent will not accept the struggle. So I just want to put that out there. Drug and alcohol use, remember we've already read, it increases the likelihood of a suicide attempt by 50%. Drug and alcohol use. Romantic stresses, so you could be in a relationship. It doesn't take a relationship ending to push someone to think about ending their life. It doesn't take that. It could just simply be infidelity. And I don't mean simply as if infidelity is a small thing, but it could be infidelity, or it could be a divorce. So a lot of folks are in relationships where they're not divorced, but for all intents and purposes, the romance has died. You know, the relationship is over. They may be in the same context, in the same house, in the same relationship. They may be staying together for finances or for children, but in their minds, something has died and there's massive loss. And even for those people, romantic stress could be the tipping point. Again, we talked about pathology, depression, anxiety, and other disorders. And of course, access to lethal means. So here in the United States, where folks have the right to bear arms, almost 50% of successful suicide attempts are carried out by firearms, right? So again, a family history of suicide ideation. For some strange reason, if you grew up in a family where family members have committed suicide or have tried to commit suicide, then what it does in your brain is it tells you that this is the way that you deal with the problems when they become too much. So family history is an issue. Interpersonal problems, problems with other people that you care about, constant problems that are not going away. Parent-child conflicts. I remember actually when I attended presentation college, I remember my mom thinking that she thought I was too soft, right? Which is, kind of hilarious right now. But anyway, she thought I was too soft. And she said, I need for you to harden up and toughen up. I think you're too soft. You're a boy, you have to be tough. And I said, no, I'm good. But she's like, no, you're not. And so she went to the school and she had forced me to enroll in the cadet corps. If you know anything about what the cadets were like back then, the person in charge can do things like corporal punishment, like if you're not marching properly or you're not following the instructions precisely. They literally could, back in the day, I'm not saying they're doing that now, so don't go to presentation college and say Dr. Jacob said, right? But back in the day, years ago, decades ago, they would take you in a back room and they would really whack you. I mean, like all the boys would really whack you, and you had to take it. And so my mother actually thought that this kind of thing is what I needed to toughen up. These are the kinds of things that parents push their children into that cause children to feel a sense of hopelessness. Fortunately for me, I was not at all suicidal, so I just took my pain and dealt with it and survived it, as you could tell. Also on this list is emotional and physical pain, prior attempts. So anyone who has attempted to commit to take their life, by suicide in the past, you should automatically assume that their risk level is way higher. If they've tried it before, there's always a possibility that they'll try it again for the same reasons. Lack of social support. Again, remember what we just read about Job, not losing his children, not losing the support of his wife. None of that did anything until he realized that he didn't have his friends with him. So lack of social support, very important. Bullying on that list, especially for young people in school, very important. And a stigmatizing culture. And I am sorry to tell you that in our church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we still do stigmatize suicide ideation. We still do. We have a lot of work that we have to do in that area. Okay, because you've already heard a lot from the previous presenter last week about suicide, I wanted to take a few different angles. Sorry, I'm segueing into a little bit of more of the religious aspect of it, and also a little bit into the relational aspect, because for young people, in terms of their list, the list of reasons why they would take their lives, on that list is like a relationship breakup, relationship problems. And so we have to talk about relationships as well. So let's take a look at this. So this is the creation of man as is described in Genesis. And you see the picture being depicted here is of God getting ready to breathe the breath of life into Adam so that he becomes a living soul. Genesis doesn't go into the details of how God brings together his sinews and his bones and which hormones and neurohormones he pours into him, but we can assume that he pours in to him everything that he needs. And I wanted to focus especially on the neurohormones, okay? So think about this. Adam, let's say Adam, of course, once he was awake and Eve was awake and they were alert and alive, even though they were fully grown adults, maybe the equivalent of what we would be at 25, let's say. And one day when we have more time, I'll tell you why I chose the number 25. So they're newborn babes, they're adults, but they're really babies in terms of their brain. So their brain is a clean slate. It's blank. There's absolutely nothing on there except whatever God was able to share with them. And so any experiences that they had, which they would have had in the Garden of Eden, would have shaped their brain. So you see in the brain there, but the brain is malleable. Nothing there needs to remain the same. Like you have the hippocampus, but we now know that depending on what kind of experiences you have, that area of the brain, the hippocampus that's responsible for memory, the amygdala, those can change shape depending on the experience. And sometimes they can change shape and change their form in a way that could cause problems like PTSD, for instance. So any experience that we have in the first few months and first few years, they shape our brain. And sometimes there's a rewiring of the neurons, right? So what did Adam and Eve experience that might have changed them, which would have changed us because they are our predecessors? So I don't need to tell you, you know exactly what happened. The big event in their lives was the fall. Everything changed. Everything changed. Their world changed. The animals changed. Their bodies changed. Sin entered the picture. Now I want to talk about 3 hormones because I think that they have something to do with what we're talking about, which is suicide. So oxytocin is a hormone that God gave to Adam and Eve so that they could bond. It's called the love hormone. It's responsible for bonding. Testosterone also plays a role in bonding, but testosterone, as the Bible describes it, was more used, I would say, by Adam, both Adam and Eve, to take command of the animals, because God said, be fruitful and multiply. You'll need the oxytocin for that. And also, I want you to subdue the earth, and I want you to have dominion over all the animals. They have to listen to you. When you speak, they obey. Testosterone is the hormone that is implicated in all of that. And then serotonin is our happy hormone. So if your mood is stabilized and you neither depressed or anxious, then your serotonin levels are just what they're supposed to be. But once the fall was introduced, something went wrong with these hormones. And you need to know that for quite a few of the mental health problems that people experience today that actually lead to suicidal attempts, a lot of them, anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, a lot of them are implicated in an unbalance of serotonin. But is it possible that that imbalance began here at the fall? Because scientists are finding that there is a heredity factor, meaning that, if you had a parent with a certain psychological disorder, they can pass it down to you. But how far back did this come from? Did this all start from the fall? And I'm making this point to say, very often when we find ourselves in a situation where we feel like we don't want to live, there is some self-blame. You think to yourself, what's wrong with me? Why am I thinking like this? Why am I thinking suicidal thoughts? Why can't I handle my own affairs and handle the problems that come? But maybe part of the blame and part of the reason goes all the way back. Now, for the young people, I want to tell you about oxytocin. So oxytocin was the hormone that God gave to Adam and Eve to have them be bonded to each other. If you know anything about oxytocin, when two people have a high in oxytocin, it works so powerfully that they've done experiments with men who they've given injections of oxytocin or had them breathe like a nasal spray. And when they breathe that oxytocin, they've noticed that the men did everything in their power to stay away from other women. They did not find other women attractive, only the wife. This is the power of oxytocin, even when it's administered as an experiment. So Adam and Eve had this oxytocin, and God gave it so that they could be bonded together and not go outside of their marriage. This is how strong oxytocin is. And I want you to think to yourself, remember when God created Adam and Eve, they lived to be almost 1,000 years, but he had intended that they would be together as a couple for eternity. So how strong does oxytocin have to be so that two people find each other attractive and they're attached to each other forever, not wanting anyone else? It has to be some pretty strong stuff, right? Like crazy glue, right? Now, young people, put yourself in our day after the fall. When you connect yourself to someone else, it is still the same oxytocin that is causing the attachment. As it turns out, if you were just talking with the person, maybe holding hands, there's a certain amount of oxytocin and you begin to bond with that person. But what they found is that the more physical you get with someone, right up to the ultimate physical expression of love, there is 5 times more oxytocin produced in your body, which creates 5 times more attachment. I absolutely believe that the young people who become suicidal when they are going through a breakup, it is because of this high level of oxytocin in that individual that caused them to think of this person in terms of a lifetime mate, while the person was probably never thinking that at all. This to me is the highest reason why people have to be very careful when you're going into relationships. You want to make sure that you take your time, that you get to know the person, and you want to leave all that heavy, high, intimate stuff for down the road when you're absolutely sure. This is the reason why your pastors would have advised and your ministers would have advised that you save sex for marriage, because you don't want to have to get that attached with that crazy glue. And then the person just, well, I discovered that you're not the one, and they're gone because they didn't have that level of oxytocin for you, and now you're suffering. So what happened to Adam and Eve when the fall occurred and the hormones started going haywire? I want you to take a look at this, because this is now giving us an idea of what happened with their personalities and their brain. So remember, there was a split. I believe that in terms of the personalities they had, there was a split. I went back and I noticed that God told both Adam and Eve that they were supposed to be fruitful and multiply and bear children. I used to think that God just gave Adam the responsibility of having dominion over the animals. But then when I went back and I read the text, it literally said both Adam and Eve were to have dominion. So it seems to me like there was more commonality in the hormones that they had, that they needed before the fall. And it seems to me that after the fall, the hormone began to go into a state of imbalance. For instance, on the left, God said to Adam, because of what you did, you are going to find it very, very difficult to provide. You're going to spend most of your day, in the ground, just trying your best to eke out a living, subsistence living, so you could provide for your family. So Adam's and every male after him, their hyper focus was on providing. It was on activities. It was on self-interest. It was on things. And if you know anything about how those men back in the day provided food for the family, there was a lot of solitude. If they're hunting, you have to be quiet. You can't scare the animal. If you're fishing, you have to be quiet. You can't scare the fish, which, by the way, would never work for me because I like to talk a lot. And so I don't go on fishing trips with my friends. I couldn't do it. Like, I don't know how I would survive if I were living in Adam's day, because I would scare all the animals and I wouldn't be catching anything. But that is what it was like. And so remember, Adam is still very young in his brain. So his brain is being shaped around this: activities, self-interest, solitude, things, and providing. On the right, Eve was given a different thing by God. She said, God said, you know what, you're going to be focused on childbearing, and it's going to be very difficult and very painful for you. And so, as it turns out, the priority for women back in those days was from family. They became more communicative because they had to communicate with the children like 24/7. Higher intimacy because they had to provide that love and nurturing for the children. And they will focus more on other people than themselves, because that is what came about by the fall. Eve was no longer sharing that load with Adam. So coming down to today, what we find is a personality, an interactive personality that is very complex. It is so complex that it caused us to, as an organization, it caused us to want to find a way to create a test that could allow you, whether you're single or whether you're married, to find out what your partner's interactive needs are. In Adam and Eve's time before the fall, it was very, very simple. They were together, they were going to do everything together, provide each other's needs. But once the fall occurred, we have some pretty complex personalities. So here are the 6 things that I wanted to point out. As I said, I would make this a little relational just because I wanted to provide something a little different, especially for the young people, and also for those of you who are married and wondering, why am I fighting? Why are we having these fights? If you've ever had a fight with your partner and you're wondering at the end of the fight, what was that about? Very often it's about one of these 6 basic needs for connection that is not being met. So let's do XY communication first. XY communication is, it says not just what type you need, but how much you need to connect, right? So that's communication. People focus on the style, the communication style. We focus on the amount, how much are you communicating? And then XY intimacy. For this, you need to know both the type and the amount of intimacy needed. Some people like to hear, I love you 5 times a day. Some people would prefer just a little, hand holding or hug. Then there's adaptability. Adaptability is about can you learn, can you grow and pivot and change? We tend to do better with folks who can do those things, because you have to. When you get with someone, you have to learn their ways and learn their needs and adapt to suit, right? Then there's interactivity. Inevitably, you will need to resolve conflict. There is no couple without conflict. So it says here, do you and your partner resolve conflict in compatible ways? The idea is you have to resolve conflict in the same way. Then there's connectivity. How close do you need to be to feel connected? Some people don't need to be that close to feel connected. But if you need it and that person doesn't, and that person wants to do his own thing, and you want their interaction, then you begin to feel disconnection. Then lastly of the 6, there's social relational connection. And by the way, connection is a real word, didn't make it up. It really means bond. So it's similar to the connection that is spelled with the C, but when it's spelled with an X, it really means strong bond, right? So social relational connection. Do you need your social connections more than your relational bonds to feel secure and grounded? This became a big issue in the pandemic. Some people were stealing away from their families and from their wives and breaking curfew in Trinidad so that they could go and hang out with their boys, hang out with the guys. Why? Because that is how they get their sense of self. And so the pandemic was not going to stop that for them. So they put themselves and their families at risk and went out. So that's important. So as I said, we create testing because of the complexity now that is involved in relationships. And then there are also assessments to assess for the crisis that comes about when you find yourself in a hopeless situation and you want to prevent disconnection. So what we're going to do next is we're just going to look at a list, which is going to be, I think, our last list of ways to prevent. Now, you can't, I don't like the idea of saying that you could prevent someone from taking their lives. What we try to do is we try to minimize the likelihood or the possibility that it might happen. That's all we can do. We do the best we can and we reduce it. But to say that we could ever completely eliminate it before we get to heaven, I mean, while we're still here on earth, I don't think that that's possible, but we need to know how to do whatever we can. So number 1 on prevention, change how you talk about it. Now, I might myself in this presentation, I might have forgotten and might have said committed suicide, but they do not want us to use that terminology anymore. They do not want us to talk about someone committing suicide. Why? The word commit is used to talk about crimes and sin. And it has a bad connotation. It has a bad connotation. So if you tell one person, yeah, Sister Joe, he tried to commit suicide, there's no way that you can't, in that person's subconscious brain, there's no way that you can take away the fact that he did something wrong. He tried to commit. So instead, you should say, if somebody died from suicide, you say that person died from suicide. You could say that person took his life, but you don't want to say anything about commit, okay? Number 2, emphasis should be on one's relationship with God, their love for him rather than their fear of him. I've actually heard church members talking to other church members, especially young people, and telling them, you're going straight to hell, right? You're going straight to hell if you take your life because there's no chance for you to ask for forgiveness. I want you to know that approach does not work. And it doesn't work because the pain that person is experiencing is so severe at that point that means nothing to them. That means nothing to them. Yes, the afterlife, no. If you want to use our faith to help someone, you talk to them about God and his love for them and how hurt he would be, if they were no longer in the world, something like that. But no going to hell, and yeah, put that away. Don't do that. Number 3, talk about it with a teenager. I was asked by a lady not too long ago to not talk to her son about. Now she wanted me to talk to her son, and her son, she was afraid that her son might be having suicidal thoughts, but she didn't want me to mention the word. By the way, you need to know it's a myth, an old myth, that talking about suicide will increase the likelihood that the individual will attempt suicide. This is not true. As a matter of fact, it is just the opposite. Absolutely the opposite. You need to talk about it with them. You need to use the word. Don't be afraid. It's not going to push them over the edge. Number 4, don't dismiss this. I said this before, and I think it's worth repeating. Don't dismiss this as a teenage phase. Most likely it is not, and it's going to need to be monitored for a very, very long time. Number 5, we need to change our church culture by making it okay for folks to seek professional help. I am Trinidadian. Even though I live here, I know what it's like. I know how people viewed St. Anne's when I was there. I don't know if St. Anne's is still St. Anne's, but that by itself had a bad connotation. It's like, oh, he went to St. Anne's. We have to change that culture. It must be okay, and our young people must see it as okay for somebody to seek professional help. Also, I have had to counsel individuals who had horrible mental health issues, generalized anxiety disorder, anxiety disorders, they had major depressive disorders, and they would not seek medical help. They tried everything in the book. And yes, I have no problem against ashwagandha. I have no problem against St. John's wort and whatever it is you want to try that is natural, if your doctor approves it. But here's the thing, if you've been doing that for 2 years and 3 years and nothing's changing, why not seek a professional? It really isn't different. If we are physically ill, we go to a medical doctor and we take whatever they give us. And then we understand that we don't have to take it for life. Once we're better, we could stop, most times. Well, when your mind is having, you're struggling with mental problems, it's the same thing. You go to a doctor, one is the body, next one is the mind, and you get help. But our church culture is very much against that. I've heard people mention the health message and use that as a reason why they shouldn't take any medication for their severe problems. We have to change that. We have to change that, because while we sit and doodle and debate, we have people dying, right? There was one psychologist in a TED Talk who once said that talking about failed attempts is a strong deterrent, especially for young people. Now, I have to say, most attempted suicides fail. I don't know if many of us realize that most suicides, the majority of suicidal attempts fail, but most of those failures leave their victims disabled for life. I cannot tell you how many people are paraplegic and quadriplegic because they attempted to take their lives and failed. Now there's no taking of your life if you're quadriplegic because you're under other people's care. And now you're living for the rest of your life in that state, realizing that you brought that upon yourself. So this is one psychologist's view, but I'm just saying it's something to think about. You attempt, for those who make that attempt, when they fail, it's misery on the other side. In other words, they're worse off having tried than not. So I'm just putting that out there. That's another view. Lastly, number 7, I think that we need to create a community within our community, loving groups, even within our church. Sometimes we think that, oh, once we bring these young people into the church, then we've done what God asked us to do, right? We've made disciples. I don't think it's enough. There's a reason why Jesus had 12 disciples that were his inner circle. That inner circle feeling allows you to experience something even beyond just simply calling yourself a Seventh-day Adventist. You have this little group of people that care for you, like literally care for you. And you guys can hang out with each other. You could do things together. You could pray and you can support each other. So it's kind of like a church within a church. And I would like to see this for all our churches, because some of our churches are pretty large. The church I attend has over 1,000 people. Absolutely need small groups within that group, even though everybody in my church, as far as I could tell, they're pretty loving, but still, it helps to have this smaller group. I wanted to highlight the participants of the Five Rivers Seventh-day Adventist Church. I know many of you have watched their programs and their skits, and you've seen Brother Hutchinson, and you've seen some of the people working there. And I want you to know a little history of where they came from. They came about, and by the way, that's the church that I grew up in. And they came about when about 12 young people had joined the church. And my mom, Sister Jacob, at the time, she thought to herself, well, they need to be protected. Okay, that would seem kind of weird to me at the time, because they're like, protected from whom? From their, new church members? I don't know what she meant by it, but she just felt that this little group needed to be nurtured. So she pulled them together as a little group, and they would eat together and do things together and pray together and read their Bibles together and study Ellen G. White. And then they would go and take trips. And they became this tight little group. Well, you know what? Now that I look and I see what's happening in Five Rivers SDA, I see the benefit, not just for emotional support, but definitely for spiritual growth. Because what that group is doing in Five Rivers SDA right now, my mother is able to sit down and watch them on Sabbaths and just see the fruit of her labor. So even within your groups, form groups within a group. Everybody doesn't have to, be as tight and as close with everybody else. But if they have one little group, of supportive group that they can know and they can learn how to love well, I think it's beneficial. So we have come to the end, and I'm going to end the way I promised, which is, remember that question that I threw out to you at the beginning, and I asked you if you thought that Job was suicidal? Well, I'm still asking you, after what we've said, I still want to know, do you think that Job was suicidal? And did your answer change? So I think what we're going to do next is we're going to have a bit of a question and answer period, and you can ask some questions. And then you can let me know what you thought about about Job and being suicidal. So I want to thank you for listening. I think it's just short of an hour, but I wanted to thank you and give it back over to Sister Abigail.
Thank you so much for that information that you've given to us this afternoon. Those of you who would have questions, feel free to raise your hand or post it in the chat. You may know someone who would have attempted suicide at any given point in time, even if it may be in your childhood or what, and you have some kind of question you need to know why, or you can feel free to ask. But Dr. Jacob, I have one question actually. Mm-hmm. I would like to know, I know that you specialize in relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And I would like to know what But do you think at least 5 of the main reason why, I know you would have probably touched a little on your presentation, why people would want to commit suicide? I personally believe that that pain plays an integral part in that. So I don't know if you could share some more on that.
Yeah, and it depends. There are variables to consider. For instance, it changes by country. There are some basic things that are international and universal, right? But it's a little different for young people than it is for adults. But there's some basic themes. So generally, people, yes, pain, like you said, there is some emotional pain that the individual feels they can no longer cope with, they can no longer deal with, right? And so associated with that is depression, because when the pain gets to that level, most of those folks are depressed. So whether they're young or whether they're older, depression is on that list, right? Some people would say psychosis or mental health problems. If you are schizophrenic, folks that are schizophrenic usually, they're either seeing they're seeing things that are not there, or they're hearing voices, and very often, interestingly enough, those voices are asking them to hurt someone else or hurt themselves. That there are some people that in their late teens, they begin to experience that. And so mental health is a factor. I think I'd mentioned also that alcohol use, which is on the rise with young people, alcohol use and drug use, that's on the list. It's a tipping point. For the older people, which was interesting to me, for the older people, they said their philosophy about living is also on the list as a contributor to them taking their lives. And this is how they talk about it. For people who are older and infirmed and disabled, especially if they're in pain, again, they have this kind of euthanasia type thinking, where they feel that they would strongly consider ending their lives. So as you get older, the list shifts a little bit, but also, of course, ending a relationship, divorce is on that list. And for young people, it's a little different. There's no divorce, right? If you're a teenager, you're probably not married. But when the girlfriend says, I'm done with you, I don't want to be with you anymore. There are a lot of parents, now that I think about it, if my mom is watching this, she's going to hear me say this because, she knows it's true. There are a lot of parents who would say to their 14-year-old and their 15-year-old, you don't know what love is. You don't know what love is. Just stop this mourning and moping. You know what I'm saying? Not realizing that oxytocin doesn't have any age limit. You could be 12 and have a lot of oxytocin and find yourself bonded to somebody that you think you're in love with, and it could be enough to cause you to hurt yourself. So again, on that list is problems with romantic problems, philosophical problems. Oh, impulsivity for young people is also on that list. They found that the more impulsive a person is, if you combine impulsivity with suicide ideation, then you get someone who is likely to act first without thinking about the consequence. So if it's a cry for help, they could go too far. The one thing that I don't think is something that we think about as Adventists, because we have a culture, and our culture is more spiritual, more spiritual and more biblical, but there is on the rise accidental suicides among young people, because there's this new trend of oxygen deprivation, where they will choke themselves. And so in some high schools, they do that, and they're doing that because it gives them a type of high, like if you're taking a drug. So they choke themselves to reduce the amount of oxygen going to the brain for a euphoric effect. But they don't always know how far is too far. And so very often, some of them have died from oxygen deprivation, and some of them have had, like brain injury from it. So I would say those are the main things.